so you can hear me. ॐ अज्ञानातिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकथां मह्यं ददति स्वपदान्तिकं। वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरो श्रीयुतापदकमलान् श्रीगुरुवैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं सागरजातं सहगणरघुनाथान्वितं तां सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधाकृष्णपादान् सहगणललिता श्रीविशाख अन्वितांश्च नमां विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रस्थाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्तस्वामिनिति नाम्ने नमस्ते सारस्वतीदेवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेषशून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशतारिणे वञ्चकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे. We are reading from Śrīla Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta volume 1 chapter 8 titled New Delhi, crying alone in wilderness. Just final check, you all are able to hear me properly, clearly?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay, thank you. New Delhi, crying alone in the wilderness. I have got the clue of going back to Godhead just after leaving my present material body, and in order to take along with me all my contemporary men and women of the world, I have started my paper Back to Godhead as one of the means to the way. Please don't think of me as something wonderful or a madman when I say that I shall go back to Godhead after leaving my present material body. It is quite possible for everyone and all of us. From a letter to India's President, Mr. Rajendra Prasad. When Abhay arrived in Mathura, he sought out Keshava Maharaj, who was now establishing his mutt, and presented him with the deity of Lord Chaitanya. At Keshava Maharaj's request, Abhay agreed to stay there and edit the Gaudiya Patrika. Abhay was given a room, and for the first time, aside from brief visits, he lived in a mutt with his godbrothers. As a senior, experienced devotee, Abhay held classes and instructed the brahmacharis, who were young, uneducated, and even illiterate, in the discipline of devotional service and the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. He had only recently begun his duties when Bhakti Saranga Goswami, another sannyasi godbrother, asked Bhaktivedanta Prabhu to assist him in New Delhi at his ashram Gaudiya Sangha. Both Keshav Maharaj and Bhakti Saranga Goswami recognized Abhay as an accomplished writer and editor and wanted to work with him. It was accepted among Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's disciples that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Prabhu was an expert preacher and writer, whether in English, Hindi, or Bengali. Now Keshav Maharaj wanted Abhay to stay and work on Gaudiya Patrika, while Sarang Maharaj, who had to go to Bengal, was requesting him to come to Delhi to produce the harmonist, known in Hindi as Sajjana Toshani. Abhay was agreeable to Bhakti Saranga Goswami's proposal, and Keshav Maharaj consented on the condition that Abhay also continue to edit Gaudiya Patrika, at least by mail. As an editor, Abhay was in his element and he was happy to preach in cooperation with his godbrothers. Although Abhay didn't consider himself an accomplished scholar or author, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had been pleased by his writings and had encouraged him to continue. And now these senior sannyasis of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati were turning to him for help. They were practically competing to see who would get the benefit of his services. Perhaps Abhay thought this should be his life's work, serving humbly under the direction of his godbrothers. His ejection from Jhansi had been a kind of setback. At least it had left him temporarily unsure of how Krishna want to use him. But now his god brothers seemed to be answering the question. Living and working in an ashram with brahmacharis and sannyasis was a way of life Abhay had once considered too austere, and Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had remarked, better he live outside your company. But now he would either have to struggle alone with nothing or stay within the shelter of friendly portion of the Gaudiya Math. Perhaps he could carry out his desires to preach Krishna consciousness within the ashrams of his godbrothers. Since he would soon be the editor of Sajjana Toshini, he began thinking of how to expand it. It was a scholarly Vaishnava journal, but cheaply produced and with a very limited circulation. He envisioned it surpassing India's slick, illustrated weekly. It should be more popular than Time or Life magazines of America. And why not? Krishna was no poor man. Abhay thought of how he could start an ambitious subscription program by approaching the many prominent and wealthy men of New Delhi. Then, by Krishna's grace, he would soon be able to print color photos and use high quality paper for Sajjana Toshini. He would give it to his best effort depending on Krishna. And while soliciting subscribers, he could take his book manuscripts and try to get them published. Dr. Alagappa in South India had wanted to publish his Gita-Upanishad. No doubt there were many men like him. Or perhaps Bhakti Saranga Goswami would be willing to publish Abhay's work with funds from the Gaudiya Sangha. Abhay soon received a letter from Bhakti Saranga Goswami's assistant, carefully instructing him how to travel to Delhi at the least expense. He was to travel by train third class to Delhi and from there take a tanga. Since tangas at the station gate charged too much, Abhay should first walk about 100 meters towards the right hand side of the station, where he would find a cheaper one. Were he to ride alone, he should pay no more than 1 rupee and 12 annas, but he should try to share the tanga with another passenger. That would be cheaper. Keeping the crematorium to your left hand side, the assistant instructed him, if you look towards the right, then you will be able to see our red flag and the signboard written in Hindi and English. When you reach here, we will pay for the tanga. At the Gaudiya Sangha, Abhay found a disconcerting state of affairs. In the absence of their guru, Bhaktisaranga Goswami, the brahmacharis were quarreling and shirking their duties, and as a result, the preaching and donation gathering were being neglected. Cleanliness, deity worship, cooking, and even peace amongst the devotees were below standard, and like most of the matas of his god brothers, the Gaudiya Sangha was poor. Abhay had come thinking he would be editing a magazine, but he found himself contending with a group of quarreling neophyte devotees. He learned that the brahmachari responsibility for giving public lectures had not done any preaching. The devotees who had previously been holding kirtans in people's homes were now negligent, and the errand boy refused to run because he had lost his bicycle. Then a brahmachari handed Abhay a letter from Bhakti Saranga Goswami requesting him to take up the general management of the mutt. Inspire everywhere to be engaged in service, otherwise, I do not know how we are going to print the English monthly magazine. Since we don't have much money in the fund and since the brahmacharis are quite careless, Akinchana Maharaj wrote that he is unable to take the responsibility of the management. It will be very nice if you could keep your eyes on these affairs. And Abhay found other obstacles in trying to produce Sajjana Toshini, no typewriter and bad relations with the printer. In a few days, Abhay received another letter from Bhakti Saranga Goswami telling him with what articles to print. cautioning him not to change essential elements in the magazine and reminding him of his special duty. I have asked Akinchan Maharaj to hand over the keys of my room to you so that you may use my room only for your office work. As you are there, you should try to maintain peace in the ashram for giving necessary instruction to one and all. Abhay saw that he could do no editorial work until the laxity and petty quarreling in the ashram stopped. But when he tried to help as Bhaktisaranga Goswami had directed, some of the devotees rebelled and even wrote to their spiritual master complaining. It was against many obstacles that Abhay met the publisher's deadline for the August 1955 issue of Sajjana Toshini. Yet, owing to the printer's delay, the magazine did not come out until September. When at last the first copies were delivered, Abhay sent several to Bhaktisaranga Goswami in Calcutta asking for his response. Abhay never heard from his godbrother directly, but received further instructions from Bhakti Saranga Goswami's secretary Ramananda, who pointed out various mistakes in the issue without mentioning whether Bhakti Saranga had been pleased with it. The errors were mostly technical matters of style. Abhay had done the contents page in a different way and had not printed Goswami's name exactly as he had wanted it on all his articles. Regarding Abhay's request for a typewriter, Ramananda wrote that if the matters are distinctly written, there is no necessity of them being given to the printer in typewriting. Abhay wrote to Bhaktisaranga Goswami requesting him to return to Delhi and establish a peaceful atmosphere in the mutt. Regarding Sajjana Toshini, Bhaktisaranga Goswami had suggested that the paper for the cover be improved and the whole magazine be done on nicer paper by an up-to-date press, and Abhay agreed. But improvements depended on money. The suggestion that the paper may be printed from Calcutta is all right, but my suggestion is that either in Calcutta or in Delhi we must have our own press with good equipment so that we may be able to broadcast the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in all the important languages, especially in Hindi and in English. Hindi is meant for all Indian propaganda, while English is meant for worldwide propaganda. Abhay further reported that since it was almost impossible to expect a printer to work speedily from handwritten manuscripts, he had already rented a typewriter. He also mentioned his idea for increasing the number of subscribers. Abhay's son, Vrindavan, came to live with him for a few months at Gaudiya Sangha. There was no question of Abhay's returning to his family, and Vrindavan simply associated with his father, following the routines of the mutt and helping Abhay in his duties. One day, a prominent advocate, the president of Hindu Mahasabha, paid an unexpected visit to Gaudiya Sangha. The mutt was mostly deserted and there was no prasadam on hand. So Abhay and Vrindavan received the prominent guest, cooking for him, offering him prasad, and acquainting him with the activities of the Sangha. When Abhay wasn't busy managing the disorganized mutt and working on Gaudiya Patrika and Sajjana Toshani, he spent his time preparing a Hindi translation of Chaitanya Charitamrita. Although he was more accustomed to writing in English and Bengali, he reasoned that as long as he was preaching in Hindi speaking areas, such a book would be important. Bhakti Saranga Goswami wrote that he wanted to print only 500 copies of Sajjana Toshani for the September issue, but Abhay wanted to print more. After making an agreement with the printer that the charges would be the same for 1000 copies as for 500, he wrote Bhakti Saranga Goswami informing him of the good news. Abhay also told him that he had recently secured a donation of printing paper and that he had arranged for a 1/4 reduction in postal charges. So why for the matter of saving some papers we shall not print the full number? In my opinion, we should print more than 1000 copies every month and distribute them in large scale. But Bhakti Saranga replied through a brief postcard that they should print no more than 500. Abhay continued his attempts to improve Sajjana Toshini. For him, it was not a perfunctory, perfunctory duty, but absorbing preaching. In a letter to Bhaktisaranga Goswami, he expressed anxiety over waiting for him to send articles for the next issue. Funds were scarce, so scarce that Abhay had no decent dhoti, and yet he continued to envision a glorious future of Sajjan Toshini. I wish to see this paper just to the standard of Illustrated Weekly with numerous pictures in order to make it a very popular literature, and for this I wish to move myself to secure subscribers as well as advertisers. I wish to visit good businessmen, insurance companies and government officers in this connection, but I have no proper dress at all. I want two sets of good dresses in order to take up this responsibility, and I shall be glad to have your decision on this matter. It is my heart's desire that this paper is improved to the highest elevation. Abhay also requested that Bhakti Saranga Goswami help him publish his Hindi Chaitanya Charitamrita. Some non-Bengali gentlemen were demanding the book and had assured Abhay that they would pay 25 rupees per volume. Abhay requested a loan of 600 rupees under any arrangement suitable to Bhakti Saranga Goswami for publishing the first part of this work. If this part is sold out, Abhay wrote, the other parts will automatically come out. But just as life in Gaudiya Sangh and work on Sajjana Toshani under Bhakti Saranga Goswami's hand produced strain for Abhay, Abhay's ambition for increased circulation and his strong editorial opinions also created strain for Bhakti Saranga Goswami. In response to Abhay's letter, Bhakti Saranga Goswami's secretary Ramananda wrote a letter full of flowery praises of Bhakti Vedanta Prabhu, but with the intent of dismissing him from his position with the Gaudiya Sangha, with innumerable humble obeisances at the lotus feet of a Vaishnava. Srimad Bhaktivedanta Prabhu. We received your letter written to Sri Guru Maharaj on 5/10/55. Your project is very lofty and you are a well-wisher of our society. We got to know that also. Since the last 2 months, in spite of so many difficulties, the difficulties of prasadam and misunderstanding of the devotees there, and in spite of various other difficulties, the kind of enthusiasm that you have shown, that is possible only for an elevated Vaishnava like yourself. You are a favorite Vaishnava of Srila Prabhupada and a friend of all the special associates of Srila Prabhupada. Most of the devotees in Gaudiya Sangha ashram in Delhi are new and less respectful. They cannot give proper respect to an elevated personality like yourself, especially the lofty speculations that you have. Our society at the present circumstances has a little ideas. We hope with all your qualities, very soon you will become settled independently and fulfilling the desires of Srila Prabhupada, start preaching very widely. We are suspecting that it won't be possible for an able and respectable Vaishnava like yourself to stay there long, adjusting with the illiterate and less educated devotees of Gaudiya Sangh in Delhi. Moreover, you are the head of the editorial board of Srimad Keshav Maharaj Vedanta Samiti's Gaudiya Patrika and Bhagavat Patrika. So if you spend much time in our ashram, then he might become annoyed. With many devotees, he is setting out to circumambulate the land of Braj, and we are sure that he will need your assistance in this parikrama. So you consider all the pros and cons, and if you do not neglect the duty as a leader of his organization, we will be pleased. Some articles have been sent for the October issue, Sajjana Toshani, and some more might be sent. We will be very much obliged if you would instruct Keshavananda Prabhu to publish the October issue. We hope that Sri Guru Maharaj will be able to personally publish the November and December issues. We wish to transfer it to Calcutta from the month of January. Sri Guru Maharaj has become old and most of the times he has to depend on us. We are happy to know that you are trying very hard to publish the Chaitanya Charitamrita in Hindi, but at the present circumstances, it won't be possible for us to invest 600 rupees from our fund in order to print that, because Sri Guru Maharaj has taken up many projects in different directions now, and he has to spend a lot of money, so he can't take the responsibility of printing that book. Keshavananda Prabhu wrote that your clothes are getting torn, so buy a pair of clothes from the funds of the temple, and if the devotee commits offences at your lotus feet due to their short sightedness, please forgive them. Signed, the servant of the Vaishnava, Sri Ramananda Das. It was not a fact that Abhay was being called for leadership in Keshav Maharaj Parikram, although it was a good excuse for Ramanand's suggesting that Abhay leave the Gaudiya Sangh. So, after living as a dutiful man in the ashram of Keshav Maharaj and Bhakti Saranga Maharaj, Abhay was again on his own. Without income or institutional shelter, Abhay began staying in various homes in Delhi, living from week to week wherever he received an invitation. In terms of food, clothing, and shelter, these were the most difficult times he had ever gone through. Since his childhood, there had always been plenty of food and good clothes, and no question of whether he would live. He had been the pet child of his father, and he had received special guidance and affection from Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. But now Abhay sometimes felt alone. Homeless, he moved around Delhi from one temporary residence to another, a Vishnu temple, a room at the Kapoor College of Commerce, but he was seeking donors preaching from Bhagavad Gita writings. His goal wasn't to find a permanent residence but to print his transcendental literature and to establish or join forces with a pure, powerful movement for spreading Krishna consciousness. Abhay made a list of several books he wanted to publish. Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita Hindi 2000 pages, Gita Upanishad English 1200 pages, Science of Devotion English 300 pages, Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan Movement English 300 pages, Message of Godhead English 300 pages, Bhagavanir Katha Bengali 50 pages. But to print he needed donors. He called on wealthy men in their offices and homes, presenting his manuscripts and explaining his mission. He had a list of donors, but few responded, and when he did receive a donation, it was usually only 5 or 10 rupees. Occasionally, he would receive a letter of appreciation or endorsement. One appreciation came from Narain Das Rai Bahadur, a retired executive engineer and secretary of Birla Mandir Trust. He had attended a public reading Abhay had held in the presence of a popular guru, Mother Anandamayi. Impressed by Abhay's reading from his Hindi Chaitanya Charitamrita, Mother Anandamayi had donated 50 rupees and suggested that Abhay also visit a well-known sadhu, Sri Hari Baba, who was lying ill in the hospital. Abhay, accompanied by Narayan Das, had then visited Hari Baba, who had claimed that Abhay's reading put him into ecstasy. Meanwhile, Naren Das was becoming inclined to help, and in December he wrote a letter suggesting that everyone extend their helping hand for the successful publication of Sri A.C. Bhaktivedanta's various writings in Hindi, English, and Bengali. I wish him all success in his noble attempt. Abhay would show this and other such letters to prospective supporters. In Delhi, it was not difficult to see government, ministers, judges, lawyers, business executives, religious heads. There was always someone willing to hear seriously and occasionally to offer support. Thus, Abhay, with the two dhotis and kurta, the Gaudiya Sangh has supplied him with his ability to preach and convince, but with little support and no fixed residence, continued his preaching undaunted. Writing and trying to publish was only half his effort. The other half was taking part in efforts for a world movement like the League of Devotees. Through Naren Das, Abhay inquired whether there might be a way he could do his work under the auspice of Birla Mandir, one of the largest and richest temples in Delhi. Abhay proposed that he be put in charge of propaganda in the English language, both within India and abroad. Since Naren Das considered himself a follower of Sanatan Dharma, Abhay wrote to him explaining how the teachings of Bhagavad Gita set forth for the real Sanatan Dharma. Abhay had many ideas about how Sanatan Dharma, as the eternal religion for all living beings, could be expanded and practically applied. If Naren Das would but help him. I want to train up 40 educated youths to learn this science of transcendental knowledge and just prepare them for going to foreign countries for missionary work. To start immediately an English paper or to revive my paper Back to Godhead in the style of Illustrated Weekly of India. to organize a Sankirtan party which shall not be only of good singers and musicians but must also be used to practice sadhana or self realization. Abhay promised that as soon as he had done some groundwork, he, along with men and equipment, could start for foreign countries to propagate this missionary work. But he admitted also that he was externally in dire straits. Kindly do arrange for the above immediately and give me a proper place to live. I must remove from this temporary quarter by Monday next latest. The directors of the Birla Mandir did not take Abhay up on his offer, but he thought of another way of engaging them. He would hold a public meeting at Birla Mandir to help generate interest in the League of Devotees. He approached Shri R. N. Agarwal, President of Delhi Municipal Committee, who, after hearing the names of several respectable people who would be attending, agreed to preside over the meeting. Abhay set the date for December 22 and printed 500 announcements and 200 invitation cards. Striking a cosmopolitan note, he stated in his announcement, by the grace of Almighty, Delhi is becoming the center of cultural association of the world. The leaders of both Russia and India had recently pointed to the need for cultural contact between all nations. But the highest culture, Abhay suggested, was scientific spiritual knowledge. Therefore, the best cultural resources in the world existed in India. And these resources, Abhay stressed, should not be left to the unorganized sadhus and sannyasis but should be taken up by important members of society in an organized way. The December 22 Hindustan Times listed the meeting of the League of Devotees in the today's engagements column, along with announcements for meetings of Rotary Club, the Tagore Society, the Indian Council of World Affairs, Bharat Scouts, and the Indian Pharmaceutical Congress. The League's meeting began with a kirtan led by Professor H. Chand and then A.C. Bhaktivedanta, founder and secretary of the League of Devotees, explained his movement's objectives. Then Naren Das spoke and afterwards read a number of proposed resolutions from the founder secretary attesting that the persons present supported the League of Devotees and that they recommended that the central government of India also support it as a movement for world peace based on Gandhian principles. After adoption of the resolutions, the meeting closed with another kirtan and prasadam. Abhay was convinced that if his well-wishers and fellow humanitarians would support him on a grand scale, he could create a movement for world peace based on the principles of devotional service to Lord Krishna. But his role was simply to present Krishna consciousness to whomever he could. The results were up to Krishna. Abhay was aware that the good intentions of most of the participants in his Birla Mandir meeting would not go past that one meeting. But he wasn't discouraged. Through all his tireless evangelism, he maintained a philosophic jollity. In one sense, he was already fully satisfied. He was happy to be working on behalf of his spiritual master. Although he was changing addresses so fast that his mail could hardly catch up to him, he wrote a newspaper ad for a home study course. Educational. Study the spiritual secrets of Bhagavad Gita at home by correspondence and be a strong man. Full course fee rupees 50 only. The instruction is imparted not in the ordinary imaginative way of qualified interpretations, but in the parampara system of preceptorial succession. All questions are properly solved. Apply AC Bhaktivedanta. Students of all communities and nationalities are welcome. He had not published Back to Godhead in 4 years since 1952, but he decided to revive it. Back to Godhead was a mission worthy of his full attention, and it took all his efforts to collect the funds, compose the articles, see to the printing, and then distribute 1,000 copies. The money he would raise by obtaining interviews and soliciting donations. One donor and friend was Justice Bipin Chandra Mishra, a Supreme Court judge in New Delhi. Justin Mishra said, he used to come to me once a month. I gave him donations for his paper. It was only a 4 page magazine, but it showed his study of the subject and his earnestness and his devotion to Lord Krishna. He appeared to be a very simple man and modest, and it was a pleasant to talk to him. He had a smiling demeanor. The main thing was his humility. He could talk with affection and confidence, and he knew we were discussing things near to God. So every talk with him would sublimate us. I was a rather important personality at that time in religious affairs, but he would not be expected to make any contribution to the main religious life of Delhi at that time because of the language difficulty, because his aim was to reach the English educated persons, not the Hindi ones. And also because his means and his popularity were not at all established, the magazine did not have a wide appeal among these people. Other religious leaders were also well established. The only thing that impressed one and was worth noticing at that time was the simplicity of his abiding faith in God's name and his mission. Writing articles was no problem. By the grace of his spiritual master, he was neither short of ideas nor unable to set them down. Translating and commenting on Vaishnava scriptures, his pen flowed freely. He was inspired by the miracle of the press, the Brihad Mridanga, the work of writing his message down and printing it 1,000 times, with the awareness and urgency of speaking directly to everyone, not just people in Delhi or India, but everyone, put Abhay into an ecstatic meditation. He would contemplate how copies of Bhagavad Gita of Back to Godhead could reach thoughtful people who might read them gratefully. Nor was maintenance a problem. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, Sukadeva Goswami has declared that a devotee's problem was not food, clothing, or shelter. If one had no bed, he could always lay on the ground and use his arms for a pillow. For clothes, he could always find some rejected garments in the street. For food, he could live on fruits from the trees. And for lodging, he could stay in the mountain caves. Nature supplies all necessities. A transcendentalist should not flatter materialists to maintain himself. Of course, Abhay wasn't living in the mountains or jungles but in the city of New Delhi. Yet he had virtually adopted the renounced mode Sukadev Goswami had suggested, not to punish his body or prove himself pure and uncompromising, but because he had to live in poverty if he wanted to regularly produce back to Godhead. For Abhay, it was a great labor of love, and purchasing paper for printing became a priority even before eating. Neglecting his personal needs for preaching was a manifestation of his faith in Krishna, for which Abhay suffered no scarcity. He had full faith that if he served Krishna, he would be provided for. To work alone was not an insurmountable problem, it was a pleasant and simple. It was better than having to manage the neophyte inmates of Gaudiya Sangh. The ecstasy of working hard to serve his spiritual master was not a problem. The problem was the condition of the world. According to the Shastras, the current age, Kali Yuga, would create continual degradation in society, and Abhay could see this evidenced every day in Delhi. Delhi, formerly known as Hastinapur, had been the ancient capital of King Yudhishthir, who 5,000 years before, under the patronage of Lord Krishna, had been the most opulent king in the world, and whose citizens had been fully protected and provided for. Now, after 1,000 years of foreign subjugation, India was again independent and New Delhi was the capital. Yet, even in Abhay's relatively brief 60 years of experience, he had seen Indian culture, which in his childhood had retained much of the original purity of Vedic age, degrade. Now he saw a society in which his countrymen were victimized by propaganda that they could be happy in gross materialistic indulgence. The British had introduced tea, tobacco, meat, and factories, and now, even after independence, these were a part of India's new way of life. Having driven away the British, the Indians were imitating Western ways, and India's leaders were deliberately ignoring the Vedic principles of the God consciousness, the very treasures India was meant to distribute to the whole world. Abhay had seen how India had abandoned her spiritual heritage and gone running after the modernization of the West. But now, where was the material advancement? Were Indians any happier in their independence than they had been in British days? To Abhay, the overpopulated city was a hell of ruffians and fools. Although thousands of poor people were employed in the burgeoning steel mills and tire factories, their living conditions had worsened. Abhay voiced his concern about these conditions in his Back to Godhead. Could the poor eat the nuts and bolts produced in the factories? Could they be nourished by cinema, television, or sex songs on the radio? The leaders were unable to see that abandoning spiritual principles had led to the very ills they officially abhorred: a decadent, rebellious youth, corruption in every area of civic life, and even economic instability and scarcity. When Abhay had been a youth in Calcutta, there have been no cinema, billboards advertising lurid sexual fantasies. But now India had developed the third largest movie industry in the world, and film advertisements were all over in Delhi. Beef shops and liquor shops had sprung up. The newspapers regularly ran editorials deploring the degradation of young Indian boys who teased, insulted, and affronted women on the street. Women's leagues complained about increased juvenile promiscuity and the obscene treatment of women in films and advertisements. But there were no upright Brahmanas or saintly administrators to do anything about it. Abhay saw the need for a re-spiritualization of society, but society was rushing headlong in the opposite direction. In February, even as Abhay was trying to publish his Back to Godhead, Prime Minister Nehru, while speaking with concern of India's crisis of the spirit, simultaneously launched another 5-year plan for rapid industrialization. Everyone from the Prime Minister down to common man was concerned about the simple symptomatic problems, but no one seemed to understand that the real problem was lack of God consciousness. Abhay had to deliver the medicine for the ills of Kali Yuga. He knew it was needed on much larger scale than he could reach on his own. But even to administer one issue of Back to Godhead magazine was almost beyond his means. Writing the articles, typing them, taking them to the printer, and distributing them should not have been the work of one lone, impoverished devotee, but in working with his god brothers, he had met with their decided lack of organization and their lack of desire for vigorous preaching. Bhakti Saranga Goswami had seemed determined to keep Sajjana Toshani small, and his mutt, like so many others, had been ineffectual in attracting new members. This was the petty mindedness that would cripple preaching. Therefore, he was now working alone on a small scale, happy in his spiritual welfare work, yet aware that his 4-page newspaper was only a drop of water in the desert. In February of 1956, while the US was struggling with civil rights, while Khrushchev and Eisenhower were both openly deploring the arms race and were maneuvering in nuclear disarmament talks, and while the Shah of Iran was visiting New Delhi, Abhay was trying to print Back to Godhead. In winter's discomfort, he walked through the early morning streets of Delhi to visit Surendra Kumar Jain, the printer, to read the latest proof. By walking, he saved money. Only when he was delivering paper from paper dealer to the printer would he rent a rickshaw. He had no chadara, only a lightweight cotton jacket, and he wore rubber shoes. He also wore a cotton hat that covered his ears and tied beneath his chin, protecting him from 40-degree wintry morning and the sometimes gusty winds. Kumar Jain. My first impression was that he was a nice person and straightforward. I felt pity also because of the conditions under which he would come. I know he didn't have even 25 paisa. He would come all the way on foot and without any breakfast or anything. He would come in the morning to press, and when I would ask him, Swamiji, did you have anything to eat this morning? He would say, Oh, no, Mr. Jain, I just came because I had to see the proofs. That's all right, I would say. I will get breakfast for you. I would call for breakfast and then he would sit and work. He would do the proofreading himself. The printing was done by me, and most of the time he would like to be present when that final printing was being done. He would come in the morning around 7 and stay until he had seen all the proofs. It was a regular thing that he would come without breakfast. I would arrange for breakfast, and he would sit across the table from one another for hours together. He was always talking on religious subjects only. But when we would be sitting, especially when waiting for proofs to come, he would discuss many things. I felt that he knew quite a lot because he was a well read person. He was more a friend than just a person coming to get things printed. He was a very simple man, straightforward in his habits, but his mission at that time was particularly to further the movement of back to Godhead. His financial condition was very, very weak. Sometimes the printing would be difficult because he was not able to arrange for the paper. Many times I told him that if he was feeling difficulty, why was he continuing? But he said, "No, it is my mission, and I will always carry it on as far as possible." I tried to accommodate him to the maximum possible extent, but he was a real pauper. I only did the printing and he had to arrange for the paper. So sometimes it was delayed. Although my job was printing, sometimes I would say, "All right, you are so keen, I will give you the paper." But usually he would arrange for it himself since we only did printing. He would bring it in a rickshaw. We were not uncomfortable together, but as business would have it, if the bills were standing for a long time, then I would ask him if he could do something about it. He would say, "Don't worry, you can be sure that your money is coming." I never asked him where his funds were coming from because I felt that it was his personal matter, but it was embarrassing for him when he could not pay, so I never tried to embarrass him. He was concerned that if he didn't have money, how could he print the paper? And he definitely wanted to run that paper. He wanted to preach the teachings of Gita. He thought of it as a sort of movement that it was the only way that people in the world could find peace. His conviction was very strong. After picking up the copies from the printer, Abhay would walk around the city selling them. He would take a seat at a tea stand, and when someone sat beside him, Abhay would ask him, "Please to take a copy of Back to Godhead." He also went to the homes and offices of people who had already donated or agreed to see him, and he sought out new contacts, sometimes on recommendation or sometimes by going uninvited wherever he could find a potential reader. When he delivered copies to regular donors, he would discuss the previous issues, philosophy with them, and sometimes write articles on topics they requested. Our esteemed friend Sri Bishan Prasad Maheshwari, one of the learned advocates of the Supreme Court, has requested us to write something on the principles of fruit to action with special reference to vice and its potency. Often donors agreed to see him not so much out of genuine interest or affection as out of a sense of obligation. In their traditional Hindu piety, they felt obliged to see the sadhu, take his paper, and even think well of him, but not necessarily to read his newspaper. Once, when Abhay was approaching a well to do house, the owner came onto the second floor veranda and shouted, "Go away, we don't want you here." Abhay, responding to the resistance, polite and impolite, that he met while selling Back to Godhead, wrote an article, "No Time, a Chronic Disease of the Common Man." for the March 16 edition. When we approach some gentleman and request him to become a reader of Back to Godhead, sometimes we are replied with the words, "No time." They say that they are too busy in earning money for maintaining the body and the soul together. But when we ask them what do they mean by the soul, hmm, they have nothing to reply. Mr. Meghnad Saha, a great scientist, was busily going to a meeting of the Planning Commission. Unfortunately, while going in his car on the road, he died and could not ask death to wait because he had no time at that moment. Dr. Ansari, the great Congress leader, while dying in a moving train on his way to home, said that he was himself a medical man and almost all his family men were so, but death is so cruel that he was dying without any medical treatment. Therefore, death has been described in Bhagavad as the indefatigable. Death is awaiting everyone, although everybody thinks that he may not die. There is life after death. The busy man should try to know this also as to whither he is going. This life is but a spot in his longest sovereign, and a sane person should not be busy with a spot only. Nobody says that the body should not be maintained, but everybody should know from Bhagavad Gita that body is the outward dress and the soul is the real person who puts on the dress. So if the dress is taken care of only without any care of the real person, it is sheer foolishness and waste of time. Abhay was an unusual newspaper vendor. He didn't loudly hawk his paper on the street or sell it from a newsstand. He approached individuals quietly as they sat to drink tea, or he would call on acquaintance in their offices or places of business. Taking a copy from the stack he carried underneath his arm, he would present what appeared to be an ordinary tabloid newspaper with bold black headlines across the front page. But what odd headlines! The lowest of the mankind, philosophical problems within social awareness, sufferings of humanity, the pure consciousness of nationalism. Anyone could tell at a glance that this was no ordinary newspaper. Abhay would say something to try to convince them to take it anyway, before they said no time. On behalf of his spiritual master and the previous Vaishnava authorities, he was playing a role, the newspaper salesman, a smiling demeanor, a gentlemanly invitation. No, it wasn't an ordinary newspaper, but they would find it interesting, and it cost only 6 paisa. Thus, he was extending the mercy of Lord Chaitanya, handing out the truths of the Vedas in easy to take form of a newspaper. Despite his desperate poverty and the urgency of his message, his writing was never shrill, strident, or fanatical. He wrote expecting to find his reader prepared to hear sound philosophy and always willing to accept the truth, especially when presented logically and relevantly and supported by the authoritative Vedic literature. Although experience on the streets of Delhi had shown him that people were shallow, distracted, and uninterested in self realization, he knew that most people, at least at some time in their lives, pondered the crucial themes of philosophy: whether God exists, whether He is a person, why there is suffering. So Abhay appealed to their higher sentiments. Spring of 1956 brought visits from US Secretary of State Dulles, and a few days later, Lord Mountbatten, the former Governor General of India, who was greeted at airport by thousands. Then came the celebration of the once sacred day of Holi, when urchins spray all Pasarbi with colored dyes. Prime Minister Nehru toured the Delhi slums expressing disgust at the prevailing conditions. He announced India's intention to develop atomic energy, stressing its peaceful uses. The weather warmed. A border clash began between India and Pakistan. Delhi railway workers went on strike. Meanwhile, Abhay continued to preach. He somehow managed to meet the financial editorial, and printing demands and published his sixth issue for the year of 1956, the May 20 edition of Back to Godhead. The front page carried a special notice. As a matter of principle, please read Back to Godhead and revive your deeper aspect of personality. There is nothing in it which is an ideology manufactured by imperfect sense perception, but all that it contains are messages of our liberated sages. We are simply helping them to speak again to men and women in easy language for a real life. Every responsible man and woman must therefore read it regularly at a cost of very insignificant sum of rupees 2 for a year or as 3 per month. Do not neglect it. It is for your interest. It will create a happy society of humanity. In How to Broadcast the Teachings of Bhagavad Gita, he talked about the need for spiritual organization in society. A model community, which he named Gita Nagari, the village where the Bhagavad Gita is sung, would live by the Bhagavad Gita and preach its message to the world. Praising Mahatma Gandhi for his Vaishnava qualities, Abhay suggested that Gandhi had also esteemed the Gita Nagari concept. It was the only way of relief from the sufferings caused by demoniac principled leaders who were misguiding the present demoralized civilization. He was circulating how to capture the restless popular imagination. He wanted to present Krishna's teaching in a clear, straightforward way and distribute them widely. He felt that good arguments from authoritative scripture would appeal to sane, impartial, educated people, even though they claimed to be uninterested. He knew that somehow, without abandoning his gravity and his absolute conclusion, he must capture their interest. They were relegating religion to some book of scripture on the shelf that they never read, didn't understand, or couldn't believe. He brought it to them as a newspaper, yet it was as good as the scriptures. No, it wasn't what they expected in a newspaper, but they might read it. The chanting process of the holy name of God, as conducted by the propaganda of Back to Godhead, is not pleasing to the superficial pleasure hunters describing men and women in indecent literature in national news, but it is the means of relishing the transcendental eternal life. In addition to selling Back to Godhead at tea stalls and delivering copies to donor, Abhay also mailed out free copies, both within India and abroad. For years, the vast audience of English-speaking readers outside India had concerned him, and he wanted to reach them. Having gathered addresses of libraries, universities, and cultural and governmental outlets outside India, he mailed as many Back to Godheads as he could afford. He prepared a letter for his Western readers, suggesting that they should be even more receptive than his countrymen. Although the messages contained in Back to Godhead are all gifts of ancient sages of India who actually realized the absolute truth, yet at the present moment the so called leaders of India are too much enamored by the Western way of material advancement of knowledge. They are completely neglecting the treasure house of knowledge left by the sages. You gentlemen of the Western countries have seen much about material science, and yet peace is not within your control. In most cases, you may be feeling the want of peace, although you have enough materially. This basic defect of materialism remains undetected by the misleaders of India, and therefore they are not serious about going back to Godhead, the ultimate aim of life's journey. On the home front, Abhay sent copies of his latest issues of Back to Godhead to President of India Dr. Rajendra Prasad, along with a letter warning of the perilous fate that awaits a society conducted by asuras. Please therefore save them from the great fall down. Abhay's letter of November 21 was outspoken. I have got the clue of going back to Godhead just after leaving my present material body. And in order to take along with me all my contemporary men and women of the world, I have started my paper Back to Godhead as one of the means to the way. Please don't think of me as something wonderful or a madman when I say that I shall go back to Godhead after leaving my present body, material body. It is quite possible for everyone and all of us. Abhay requested His Excellence at least to glance over the headlines of the enclosed 1 dozen copies of Back to Godhead and consider granting the editor an interview. There was an immense work to be done on behalf of India's spiritual heritage, and there should be a specific Ministry of Spiritual Affairs for this purpose. I am crying alone in the wilderness at the present moment, wrote Abhay, but His Excellence never replied. In his Back to Godhead, Abhay was making propaganda against the atheistic view. In Hope Against Hope, he frankly admitted that 80% of the people he met while selling Back to Godhead were atheists. Sometime we met gentlemen of up to date taste and try to make them interested in the matter of Back to Godhead. They say very frankly that they have not only no interest in such a theistic subject, but also they condemn the attempt to bring back people in general to the path of Back to Godhead. According to these gentlemen, economic conditions of the Indian people deteriorated on account of their too much faith in God, and the sooner they forget everything about Godhead, it is better for them. But we cannot agree with this atheistic conclusion of such up-to-date gentlemen devoid of sense of Godhead. Abhay urged that although independent India was not educating her citizens in godless materialism, her economic conditions were not improving. Many Indians did not even have the bare necessities of life. He cited that 120,000 were unemployed in Delhi. Some of the well posted government servants or some of the fortunate businessmen may feel themselves happy, but 90% of their brothers, citizens, do not know how to meet the both ends together, and therefore the economic condition is definitely not satisfactory. He quoted former United States President Harry S. Truman as saying that national independence means that the citizens should have a comfortable life. So, if that were the case, said Abhay, where was India's independence? His point was that all attempts at happiness and prosperity are unlawful as long as they fail to recognize the proprietorship of the Supreme Lord. An atheistic civilization could never produce peace. In progressive ambition and unsaturated lust, Abhay wrote, there is no dearth of money, but there is dearth of peace in the world. The whole human energy having been diverted to this money making business, it has certainly increased the cheap money making capacity of total population, but the result is that such unrestricted and unlawful inflation of money has created a bad economy and has enabled us to manufacture huge costly weapons for destroying the result of such cheap money making business. The authorities of big money making countries, instead of enjoying peace, are now engaged in making important plans as to how they can save themselves from the modern destructive weapons. And as a matter of fact, a huge sum of money is being thrown into the sea for making an experiment on such dreadful weapons. Such experiments are being carried out not only at huge cost but also at a cost of many poor lives, binding thereby such nationals in the law of karma. Those who unlawfully accumulated money would find it snatched away by taxes for wars and other agents of illusory nature in the shape of medical practitioners, lawyers, tax collectors, societies, constitutions, so-called sadhus, famines, earthquake, and many such calamities. A miser who hesitated to purchase a copy of Back to Godhead by dictation of illusory nature spent up rupees 20,000 for a week ailment and dead at the end died at the end. A similar thing happened when a man who refused to spend a paisa for the service of the Lord spoiled rupees 30,000 in litigation affairs between the members of the home. That is the law of nature. A worker in a New Delhi post office, noticing the title in the magazine Abhay was sending abroad took the opportunity to argue his atheistic opinions with Abhay. Srila Prabhupada. The postmaster was an Arya Samaji, uh, and he was talking to me about the paper, Back to Godhead. He raised the question, if we do our duty nicely, then what is the use of worshipping God? If we become honest, if we become moral, if we do not do anything which is harmful to anyone, if we act in this way, then what is the need of this? Because our paper's name was Back to Godhead, he was indirectly protesting, what is the use of propagating this philosophy of Godhead if we act nicely? That is the Arya Samaj's view, how to avoid God. So I replied that if one is not God conscious, he cannot be a moralist, he cannot be truthful, he cannot be honest. This is our point of view. You study the whole world just on these 3 points: morality, honesty, and dutifulness. But if he is not God conscious, he cannot continue such things. To revive all these good qualities in society, you first have to invoke God consciousness. A Delhi man, noticing Abhay distributing back to Godhead, remarked, "Where is Godhead? Can you show me God?" Abhay replied to the challenge, but he also pondered a deeper reply as he moved throughout the city during the day. On returning to his room, he began an article. Where is Godhead? Is it possible to see him? In the Secretariat buildings in New Delhi, there is an inscription on the stone that liberty does not descend upon a person, but it has to be earned before it can be enjoyed. Actually, this is the fact, and we have seen it that much sacrifice had to be rendered by the people of India before they could gain Swaraj. But in the matter of Godhead, some irresponsible people ask, where is God? Can you show me? Have you seen God? These are some of the questions put forward by some irresponsible men who want to have everything very cheap. If for attaining a temporary false sense of liberty in this material world, so much labor and sacrifice has to be requisitioned, is it possible to see Godhead, the absolute truth, so cheaply? To see God means complete liberty from all conditions. But is Godhead an attending orderly so that he may be present at my command? The atheist, however, demands like that, as if Godhead is his paid servant, and he thinks that Godhead is an imaginary thing, otherwise, he would have appeared before us as soon as the demand to see him is made. One time, while he was walking on a secluded street, pursuing his back to Godhead duties, a stray cow, the kind commonly seen wandering the street of an Indian town or city, suddenly charged him, goring his side with her horn, and knocked him down. At first he couldn't get up, and no one came to help him. As he lay there, he wondered why it had happened. Summer came and the 110 degrees heat made it almost intolerable to spend time out of doors. Hot, dust laden winds blew in the city streets. Street side hawkers closed their businesses during the day. In early May, during 112-degree heat, a man collapsed in the street and died of heart stroke. But Abhay ignored the heat and the ordinary limitations of the body. One day, while delivering back to Godhead to various addresses in the city, Abhay suddenly began reeling, half unconscious, overcome by the heat. At that very moment, an acquaintance of his, a man he had approached during his preaching, happened to be passing by in his car, and he took Abhay to a doctor. The doctor diagnosed him as a victim of heat stroke and ordered him uh, to rest. On June 20, Abhay produced the 18th consecutive fortnightly edition of the year, its front page article condemning both materialistic family life and false renunciation of family life. It had been almost 2 years exactly since he had left his home and taken to the Vanaprastha order, and his comments on family life seemed autobiographical as well as scriptural. He quoted a statement by Prahlad Maharaj from Srimad Bhagavatam. Persons who are always disturbed in mind with cares and anxieties of household affairs may quit off the place which is black hole temporary abode, family life, to kill one's self and take shelter under the lotus feet of the personality of Godhead by entering into the forest. And he admitted, the management of a family is more difficult than that of an empire. But trying to avoid family life by living in jungle without the real spirit of renunciation was monkey renunciation. In the jungle there were many monkeys who lived naked, ate fruits, and kept female companions. The real remedy lies in the act of accepting the service of the lotus feet of the Lord. That makes one free from all cares and anxieties of life. That makes one able to see Godhead always and everywhere. Real renunced life, therefore, was possible without going into the forest. Even if one remained in the dress of a householder, he could be freed from cares and anxieties by engaging himself in devotional service. On September 1, US President Eisenhower condemned the Soviets' secret testing of a nuclear bomb equal to 1 million tons of TNT and scoffed at Soviets' claim for peace. In the Mid East, Egypt's Nasser nationalized the operation of Suez Canal, causing an international crisis. On September 20, 81 nations met at the UN to form a new international agency to help tame the atom for peaceful purposes. Abhay saw some of the headlines and heard talk of the latest news from gentlemen he visited. He frankly told them that without Krishna consciousness, the promises of cooperation by the politicians were all phantasmagoria. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had said that if only one soul could be turned into pure devotee, his mission would be successful. Yet sometimes Abhay became overwhelmed when he thought of how small he was, how much work had to be done on behalf of Krishna, and how difficult it was to convince even one conditioned soul. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much for very patiently listening.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Yes, yes, Prabhuji. Very so no words actually. Always is the time is going very fast. Uh, we did not realize it's like 1.25 hour.
Mm.
So very ecstatic, very nice. And Prabhuji, the things are mentioned here. Now they are today also the situation is same because
Yeah.
we when we read Prabhupada book, he's mentioning uh, around 55 years before he mentioned that the purpose of the United Nation is nothing. It will not solve, not bring the peace in the world.
Mm.
And we see it today. Now today everybody is accepting this fact, which Prabhupada told already in the early stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, in so many places we come across, yeah, nuclear, where today morning 2:30 there was a threat that maybe the nuclear reactor can caught up fire in Ukraine and
Yes,
it can
Prabhuji.
become a big problem. So all these things, yeah, Prabhupada kept current affairs so much, yeah, so much. And if we see the wide range of topics that Prabhupada has written, has connected, and how everything is centered again to Krishna consciousness or lack of Krishna consciousness is amazing. Yeah, in spite of so many struggles, yeah, we see almost like it is a what do you call struggle for survival situation. Yeah,
Yes, Prabhuji.
but he was more not thinking about his material, yeah, material body. He was thinking more survival of the spiritual, yeah, purpose.
Yes, Prabhuji. Yes, Prabhuji. And Prabhuji, actually, he belongs to such a well-to-do family, and still he was struggling so much. He has not enough clothes even to wear. So
Yeah,
all these things shows his commitment. How in the times of the scarcity, how he, organized the resources, and how he himself compromised and still, take forward the mission. So very
Yeah, he's really the Maharaj,
inspiring.
right? He's
Yes,
really the Maharaj where, yeah, the time is there where he didn't had even penny, and we see later stage where Prabhupada has become the, yeah, one of the top 10 influential persons who are successful after age 70. Yeah, so,
yes, Prabhuji.
but
And one thing, Prabhuji, I want to also mention here that in each many times it is mentioned that Prabhupada was focusing on preaching to the English speaking gentry, because it has also mentioned a couple of times in in the chapter that he wanted to focus on the English speaking, because his Guru Maharaj has ordered this to him in the first meeting in. And today is that auspicious day in 1922. His Guru Maharaj give this instruction. Today was the day
again we are
that
hearing
you should preach in the English word.
mm,
And today is 2022, so it's completely 100 years
100 years.
they are celebrating. I got a news from some circles from social media that today is the 100th year completed when Prabhupada first meet the Guru Maharaj and got the instruction to preach in English. And everybody can see how it has flourished and how successful it was.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, so very, very one pity thing is that he was all alone. Yeah, so when we see here today, it's absolute like he was alone for very, very long time. Yeah, not
Yes.
a simple thing, and then he still carried such a strong passion. It's not that he had assets through which he can still single man, yeah, handle things. He went to everywhere, whatever came on his way, tried everything. And that shows his yeah, dedication for serving his Guru Maharaj and also spreading Chaitanya Mahaprabhu movement. Yeah, so very, very happy to read through. Yeah, so through these drops of nectar, and that's why it's Leela Yeah,
Thank you, Prabhuji.
thank you. Yeah, anyone else want to share your feeling, realizations? I have seen so many connections in this whole when I'm reading, right? In my own life, there were some things that happened that were correlating here. Nice. Okay. I mean, we can't hear you, Gaurav Prabhu, but I don't know. Okay. No, if there is no one to share something or ask, discuss, then we are good to close the call. Thank you so much. वञ्चाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय सत्स्वरूप गोस्वामी महाराज की जय श्रील प्रभुपाद लीलामृत की जय हरे कृष्ण
Hare Krishna.
हरे कृष्ण
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.